Climbing Gold is a production of Duct Tape and Beer, with support from the North Face. Never stop exploring. Dr. Squatch, get dirty, stay clean. Koros, explore perfection. Element, restoring health through hydration. And AeroPress, the better coffee press.
Alex, you've been climbing for how many years now?
28.
Have you ever had a coach in those 28 years?
When I first started climbing at the gym, I was on the youth team, so I had, there was a coach for the team. Mm-hmm. So there was a fellow that helped teach us technique and movement and things like that. So yeah, I had a coach a little bit. Mm-hmm. And then I've done a few sessions of sort of private coaching, or maybe it's more like training over the years, where you sort of, just have some, it's like consultations with people a handful of times. But I've never really had a coach.
Did you ever need coaching on your mental approach to climbing?
Yeah, you're laughing, but no, I read The Rock Warrior's Way. I read all the sort of mental training books, especially back when I was starting. Because, I had to learn how to climb on gear, same as everybody else. I was gripped. I thought the gear would all fall out. I thought I was soling all the time. I probably was soling all the time. That's how I got into soling. But no, I definitely read everything available about the mental side of climbing as well. Mm-hmm. And really had to practice it just as much as anybody else.
Obviously, you've played in a world where it's like you follow training plans, you go through that, you take the feedback. But do you think there's a difference between training and coaching?
Yeah, well, I think climbers, I think I often use the terms interchangeably, and I think that climbers in general often use the words interchangeably. That like a coach or a trainer, just sort of somebody who helps you get stronger as a climber. But no, I suppose the actual definition is very different. A coach helps you do your sport better, and the trainer just makes you stronger physically.
Mm-hmm. Who are we going to talk to today?
Today we're talking to Kris Hampton, who founded the Power Company. He was an early adopter in the training space in the U.S., one of the earlier companies providing remote training for climbers and basically just helping to train climbers.
Yeah, Kris noticed that there was sort of a lag between how climbers were approaching training compared to other sports like gymnastics. And he kind of dove in, and it worked. Our executive producer, Lisi Hendricks, the incredible Lisi Hendricks, joined us as well. So let's go ahead and dive in.
I'm Alex Honnold.
I'm Fitz Cahal.
This is Climbing Gold. When did you start climbing? So how many years have you been a climber?
I started climbing on April 7th, 1995, I think.
That is so wonderfully specific. Why do you, is it just that was that powerful for you? Or why do you remember that day so clearly?
It was. I grew up in a bad neighborhood, was in a lot of trouble, and I had actually just gotten out of jail. And while I was in jail, I decided I'm going to be a rock climber, because I had gone to the climbing gym one time and I loved it. So I went to the gym the day I got out of jail and I bought a month pass, and then it just took off from there.
That's kind of amazing. I feel like this should be, should we let the episode take a whole detour down a different path?
Yeah.
Because I was like, we're going to talk about climbing, but
yeah.
I was like, wait, what? So how old were you?
I was 18 or 19, probably 19, almost 19. Dude, yeah.
That's like a legitimate Scared Straight sort of deal. You get out of jail, you get into climbing, and now it's your career. I'm like, this is like a Hallmark movie.
Yeah, that's totally what it was. I just realized had bad friends and putting myself in bad environments, and the climbing gym seemed so much simpler. And so I just went there every morning to keep myself out of trouble.
And it had nothing to do with the idea of scaling the walls to get out of the prison?
That might have played a little role, but
And so do you want to talk a little bit about how you've seen climbing and climbing training change in the 30-ish years that you've rock climbed?
Yeah, so when I first started really looking into it, there wasn't much specifically about climbing. I could find things that John Gill had trained, and Backer was into training, and they had gotten Wolfgang into training, but it was all still pretty rudimentary. And what I found when I started trying to train other people was that I had to really convince them to want to train. It was very much the, training's going to take the joy out of it, or I don't train, bro. That was kind of the accepted response back then. And
anyone that says bro probably does train a little bit.
That's probably accurate. Yeah. And it took a while to convince people. And I think, there were quite a few other voices at the same time. Dave McLeod was into it. Steve Bechtel was talking about it. So there were a few other people writing about training at the time. And eventually that caught on, and now it's just steamrolling. So the big change is certainly the amount that it's been accepted. And I think maybe nowadays we're maybe even putting too much emphasis on it, and we've sort of lost the thread a little bit as far as what are we training for? Are we training just to get our fingers stronger, or are we training to climb better? Those are two pretty different things, actually.
Have you seen Hazel's little stickers for her Strong Mind course? Like Hazel Finley teaches
I haven't.
It's like a mental climbing thing. But she has these little stickers, and I forget exactly what it said, but it shows somebody like pulling on a hangboard or whatever, and with a little caption like, "Now I can overgrip on everything." Going to show that training your finger strength is helpful to a point.
Yeah.
But climbing isn't necessarily about how hard you can pull.
Yeah.
And so. Yeah, I saw it the other day. She had it on the back of this like derelict van thing that she was driving around, and I was like, "This is pretty classic, actually, and so niche." I was like, "Not like anybody gets that, Because
I love it though.
You're like, "What is it? What does it mean?" But
I'm not even a sticker guy, and now I need to get one.
I mean, I totally agree that climbing training is now cool.
Yeah,
like training for climbing is now a hip thing. And actually, I mean, I just got a text from an acquaintance, like an old friend of mine, who barely climbs recreationally in the gym, probably climbs like 10 plus. And he was asking about like training programs. Then he said that he had just signed up with the Lattice folks. And I was like, really? Like, do you need that? Or like, why? It's like how hard do you need to pull? Like, I'm pretty sure that he could see years of improvement just by going climbing and having a good time and playing with his friends. But, people like having a program. People like feeling like they're improving. I don't know. I mean, what do you think about the growth of training?
Well, I'm certainly not mad at it. It pays all my bills, so I'm quite happy about it. But I agree with you in that he certainly could continue to see improvement for a long time. I also think, though, it's not a bad thing to have a direction to go. It's easy to make mistakes, especially if there's lots of training advice out there. And you're like consuming it all on Instagram and YouTube, and now you've got like 40 different training tools, and you're not exactly sure what to do, and you're going to end up just hurting yourself most likely. So I like the idea of signing up with somebody, having a direction, if that's a thing you're interested in. Like if you're going to be consuming it, you might as well get direction from someone who knows what they're talking about. And I think a little direction and a little nudging in the right areas, making sure that you go in with intention and you have a plan and you're paying attention to the things that like when you were climbing, Alex, you probably paid attention to a lot of the things that made you better, whereas someone else may not pay attention to those things, and they might get wrapped up in just climbing the next grade, or all sorts of things could derail your progress. So I think just having a coach initially isn't a bad idea.
Mm-hmm.
I think it should be with a light touch.
Like basically every other sport has some kind of culture of drills and practice and things like that. Like if you go, to soccer practice, it is just practice. Like you're not necessarily playing soccer the whole time. You're doing drills, you're practicing ball handling, you're doing all kinds of things that aren't necessarily playing the game.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas as a climber, you're mostly playing the game and almost never practicing. And so, it seems like there's room for both, but it seems like the pendulum is swinging back toward the practice side maybe and away from the game itself.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that's happened is, and I'm not saying this is necessarily a bad thing, but it's not the philosophy that we try to keep, is that the training has been sort of separated from the climbing by quite a bit. And I think there's still so much for most people to gain through really intentional, focused climbing, especially if they're sort of led into the right scenarios so that they're gaining the experience they need. And I still call that training. Maybe it's more on the practice side, but I think that's, especially like your friend who's climbing 10 plus, that's certainly what the Lattice folks are going to have them doing more of, is just really intentional, focused climbing, as opposed to, oh, right now you need to be, training your fingers specifically. You need to be campusing. You need to be doing 4x4s. All these other things don't need to necessarily happen. And I think as long as you have a coach who understands that and doesn't just, kind of throw things at you, I think training can be really beneficial for anybody. It might just look on the outside more like really intentional climbing.
Yeah. When I think of an intermediate climber, like say a 5'10 or 5'11 climber, doing weighted hangs of any kind, it just makes me sad because I'm kind of like, the joy of climbing is climbing. And, I'm willing to do all the work. Like I'm willing to strap a bunch of weight on and like struggle through some very difficult pull-ups and things like that. I mean, I can do that, but I'm really only willing to suffer in that way because I want to climb at a high level. And I'm kind of like, if you're not already plateaued in your climbing, like why suffer like that? Why not just have a good time, enjoy it?
Yeah.
Most of climbing training is pretty freaking unpleasant, strapping on a bunch of weight and hanging on really small edges and loading your fingers in very specific and frankly painful ways. Kind of like, why do that if you're not trying to be elite, basically?
Yeah. And I think also, just to add to your point, and take myself out of a job here. Essentially, I think you can still gain quite a bit of finger strength through climbing when you're at that intermediate level. So maybe, learning how to use the hangboard, if you think you're somebody who wants to continue this for a long time and you want to be an elite climber, might be a good idea. But putting most of your finger strength building time into on the wall exercises, and by exercises, I don't mean anything specific, more like climb on hard to use holds, will probably help your finger strength as much as hanging on a hangboard is going to. And it makes it more applicable to climbing.
Big picture, like at the broadest sense, why do you think training has gotten so cool?
Well, people love it. People love climbing. And I think if you get better, faster, you get to climb cooler things sooner. I think that's really what it comes down to. Like you can't walk across any crag and not be drawn to the harder things. It's not always that the harder things look cooler, but very often they're the blankest things. They're the more defined features. They just look way cooler.
Yeah, the steepest thing and the blankest part of the cave, and you're just like, wow, I can't imagine.
Yeah.
Like it's always the most aspirational things where you look at it and you're like, oh my God, can you imagine climbing that? Like that's next level.
Totally.
But I guess the question though is, do you think that for all the people who are training for climbing now, do you think that they're more able to do those kinds of climbs?
That's a good question, actually. I would say yes.
I mean, you should hope so because that's your job. But do you actually think that people get results like that?
Yeah, I do. I think as climbing grows, more and more people getting into training and getting excited about performance, I think we're seeing just an exponential growth in the number of people who are climbing relatively hard things, right? And they're climbing really hard things by the time they're like 10.
How do you define really hard things? Or actually, I'm sort of just curious, what do you consider sort of elite, between like intermediate to advanced to elite?
I mean, if I were looking at the like giant scale of all climbers, elite doesn't start until probably mid 514 at this point. Maybe even later. It's hard to say. But I think relatively hard is the key there. And that's, people pushing their own limits. And I think that's what training is for. People just really want to see how hard they can climb. They want to climb the most challenging things for them. So it's that relatively difficult that I think matters for people.
Yeah, I think that personal sense of improvement is probably my favorite aspect of training. I mean, really, that's the thing
sure.
that gets me back into a training cycle is like, can I get any better? Can I squeeze a little bit more juice out of the fruit? You know, it's like, can I just do a little bit better?
Yeah, and it's what I love about climbing too, right? Like there's always this next level thing I can try to, you know, see, have I improved?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there are clear metrics for improvement and for success. Like that I think is important, is that you can tell if you're improving.
Yep.
But I mean, that comes back to the big picture training stuff. Like, do you think, you know, like of people that you coach, do people see results year over year?
Yeah, I think so. To be perfectly honest, I think it's impossible to say, would they have had these same results had they not trained? Maybe they would have, you know, I don't know. I like to think that they are seeing better results, but, you know, we can't do an A/B test on the same person, so it's completely impossible to say. But they are enjoying the process of training, and I think that's a real key in it, is they want to do this. They want to be doing the work to feel like they're, you know, improving at the best rate that they can, and this is what's leading them there. And I mean, I think most coaches probably have a success rate that's, you know, well below 100 in helping people get better. But I think each person can be matched with a coach that's going to work best for them. Someone might come to me and I might say, you're going to be better off right now working with Natasha Barnes or working with the Lattice folks or one of our coaches with Paul Corsaro or Nate Drolet. So there's all sorts of places people can go. And I think as long as they find a coach that they're excited about and that's willing to get to know them personally, then I definitely think they can improve faster that way.
Yeah, and to some extent, the coach doesn't matter as much as what the person is bringing into their coaching, you know, because
for sure,
no amount of coaching can make somebody better if they don't put in the hours and actually try their hardest and do the work. You know,
yeah, totally. And that could be a big problem too. We've seen lots of people come through who just think it's a magic pill, you know, that they sign up, their payment goes through, and all of a sudden they're better climbers. And it just doesn't work that way at all.
That's the same mindset when people buy workout equipment, when they're like, oh, I bought that Nordaflex or what's it called, NordiTrack. Like, why is my cardiovascular fitness not improved? And you're like, well, you have to do 100 hours on the NordiTrack every week if you actually want to feel, you know, if you want to be like a Nordic skier. Yeah, it's like, that's the thing. You can sign up for your training program, but then you actually have to spend hours and hours of like time under tension, you know, like actually straining your muscles and ligaments and tendons. And you're sort of like, oh, that's the part that's tough.
Yeah, and I think, you know, that sort of leads into another reason why training has gotten really popular is people are getting busier and busier. You know, we have crazy busy lives, taking our kids to all the sports they play and our jobs and all of these other things, and being able to narrow down what you're going to do in that 90-minute window you have at the gym is really important for a lot of people. So most of my clients are busy professionals of some sort. You know, I don't have many clients who just have all the free time to do anything they want.
We'll be back with more after the break. I've been a North Face athlete for almost 18 years, which has been incredible, and I've always appreciated their commitment to exploration. Summit Series is the name of the pinnacle North Face products that I use on every expedition, and I love that their tagline is athlete tested and expedition proven. I've personally tested these products all over the world, and they've always proven themselves. Future Fleece is the next generation base layer that I wear almost every day of climbing outside, whether on the wall or at the crag. You can shop the full Summit Series collection at thenorthface.com. Element is a zero-sugar electrolyte drink mix formulated with a science-backed ratio of sodium to potassium to magnesium. Each packet delivers a meaningful dose of electrolytes, free of sugar, artificial colors, or other dodgy ingredients. It tastes great, and I've used it extensively on expeditions. Element is formulated for anyone looking to restore health through hydration, and is perfectly suited for athletes, folks who are fasting, or those following keto, low-carb, whole food, or paleo diets. Try Element totally risk-free. If you don't like it, they'll refund your order, no questions asked. So whether you're new or returning Element customer, you can get a free Element sample pack with any drink mix order when you go to drinkelement.com/climbinggold. That's drinklmnt.com/climbinggold. aeropress.com/climbinggold. The link's in the show notes. The team here at Climbing Gold uses AeroPress to make our coffee because AeroPress combines the best qualities of a few brewing methods into one cup, and it was designed for travel. You can take it anywhere you go. Compact, durable, and reliably delicious, it's perfect for van lifing, climbing adventures, or air travel. AeroPress just released a new set of clear colors, blue, green, purple, red, and more, so you can add a touch of color and personality to your brew wherever you are. AeroPress is also shockingly affordable, less than $50, and we've got an incredible offer for our audience. Visit aeropress.com/climbinggold. That's aeropress.com/climbinggold and use the promo code climbinggold to save 20% off your order. The link's in the show notes. That's aeropress.com/climbinggold, and be sure to use Climbing Gold at checkout to save 20%. AeroPress ships to the USA and over 60 countries around the world. It's time to ditch the drive-thru, toss the French press, and say yes to better mornings fueled by better coffee. And we thank AeroPress for sponsoring the show.
Broadly, as a society, we're just all overscheduled. We're all busy. We're all kind of on the hustle for the most part, especially the kind of person that maybe is drawn to climbing. Like, do you think that the sort of rise of training has to do with that? Because it's sort of like optimizes your time in that same way that you just described.
You know what, Fitz? As a person who is drastically overscheduled myself most of the time, I think you just hit on it. Like the people who are drawn to performing well climbing are probably the same people who are drawn to performing well in their lives and are overscheduling and doing too much and having a hard time resting. And, having someone build their training schedule for them is probably really attractive.
I feel really personally called out by that. I'm like, as somebody
I'm calling
who's
myself out, Alex.
Well, yeah. Well, I'm as soon as we're done chatting, I'm going down to my little garage to do some training, and I use like roughly a lattice type of program to structure my time, and I will say that that's probably my biggest change as I slowly creep into middle age is basically just tightening my gym sessions in a way and being a little more strategic with time. And hopefully achieving the same sort of results that I would from being at the cliff for 8 hours, but instead doing it in 3 hours in the garage. I'm kind of like, well, I've got a toddler and an infant and a bunch of stuff going on. And you're kind of like, well, if I can still, manage to climb at an okay level with just fewer hours of time, I'm kind of like, well, that's good enough for me.
Yeah, and I think that's to reverse on my earlier statement, I think that's one of the benefits of like hangboarding and lifting weights is you get so much more bang for your buck in those short sessions. You can get dramatically stronger lifting weights for 30 minutes than you can climbing for, 2-hour sessions over many months. So why not just spend that 45 minutes a week instead of 6 hours a week going climbing,
No, I mean, so much of it is mental too, and learning how to perform at a high level when you do have bad conditions or when you're scared or, when you don't feel good. So I think one of the things I find interesting is that I see a lot of people in the gym like training to crank out one-arm pull-ups, but I don't see them like training the skills that they need. And I'm curious about that because I have done a lot of training programs myself through various coaches, and I find that like the skill side can be quite lacking compared to the strength side.
That's because it's easy to train the strength side, but it's really hard to train the skill side. And it's really easy to train strength remotely, but it's really hard to train skill remotely because you can't actually see somebody climb.
Yeah, you just explained our whole business model, Alex. Like it's very difficult. And, Lisi, I think that it comes down to the intention that's put in by the athlete, but the coach can guide you into that. So it's not a bad thing necessarily to build the strength in these other ways, but there's just no shortcut. No matter what your coach tells you, there's no shortcut to the experience and the putting yourself into the situations that is going to help you, learn how to give more effort or learn how to deal with the fear when you're in these scenarios. You have to get on the wall and try those things. And if your coach can develop those situations for you so that you get more exposure to them, that's a great thing. And I think that's a little more difficult than programming for hangboarding.
Earlier, you guys were sort of mentioning, where does elite climbing start? Where does what's intermediate, right? And you brought that up. And when you look at it, and I'm curious, what both of you think here, but are we nearing the limits of human potential when it comes to climbing? Like you think about that, and the holds, they've kept getting smaller, they've kept getting farther away. They've, like the move, it is just insane to watch where we were 20 years ago to where we are now. And I think, you both spend so much time thinking about this. Like, is it finite? Are we close to the sort of end, or is there just a lot more still to be done in terms of the advancements of how human bodies can shape themselves to be the best climber?
I'm curious what you're going to say, Alex. I wonder if I disagree with you. I'm curious.
I think we're not even close to actual physical human limits.
Same.
I mean, partially just because we still see such quick progress going on.
Yeah.
You just know that you can't be even close to the end when we're still making, like when you think of the world record in the marathon has barely creeped down, and people are still making incremental progress, but you're seeing very, very small gains spread over many years. And in climbing, you're seeing relatively quick gains on a yearly basis. You're kind of like, well, obviously we're not even close to the limits of human potential yet. And climbing's not even that popular yet. And so you don't even see that many people doing it. And you just have to know that there are more sort of genetic outliers out there who are going to push the sport way beyond where it's been.
Yeah, I think that's true. And, you can look at one of the world's hardest boulder problems is Burden of Dreams, V17 in Finland. And now that multiple people have been really trying it, there are all these new betas popping up. People are finding different ways to do it. And I just think that shows that even when we're in that scenario where we think there are just enough holds to get this done, somebody else is going to find a different hold or a different way to use this hold. And once you create a route that connects the crux move of Burden of Dreams, 10 times in a row, that becomes a massively different thing than what we've seen. So I agree with Alex. I don't think we're even close.
One of the prevailing themes of Climbing Gold in general, I feel like, with a lot of our different interviews, is this sort of interesting tension between adventure climbing, basically between adventure and athleticism. Like this idea of like climbing as an athlete or an athletic pursuit, like a sport versus a lifestyle or like a spiritual quest into nature. And I think that right now the pendulum has really swung into athletics, with climbing in the Olympics and with the rise in the popularity of training and all that kind of stuff. I mean, climbing right now feels very much like a sport, and people do the sport and they train and they get really strong. And, whereas in the past, certainly when we began climbing, it was much more of an adventurous like outdoor pursuit. And I wouldn't be surprised if the pendulum swings back at some point or it settles in the middle. But I mean, what do you think about that whole theme?
I think you're right. And it's interesting because I came into it from the athletic side. I was not interested in the outdoors at all. I was a skateboarder and a gymnast, and for all I cared, you could cement the entire world and I would be happy, But I've learned this love of the outdoors and of exploring outside through climbing. So I do think it is a gateway for that, if you want it to be. But I could certainly see it going even deeper into the athletic side for a while. I don't know if I see the path into it, swinging back to being a more adventurous thing. But maybe that's because I'm not keyed into that world the same as I am the athletic sort of world. But I do hope that it does do that.
The way that I can see the adventure pendulum swinging back a little bit is that the degree of athleticism is so high now that a lot of the big adventurous things could be done much better and much more easily. And so I see, and actually we're sort of already starting to see this, is some of the people who didn't make the U.S. Olympic team, let's say,
right,
going out and doing some of the hardest boulders in the world or some of the hardest, sport climbs in the world.
Yeah.
And at a certain point, some of those kinds of people are going to realize that they can say rope solo the nose in like 2.5 hours casually.
Yep.
Because, they're a failed Olympic speed climber who didn't quite make the team, but they're like, turns out that the records on all these big walls are really, really slow if you're an Olympic speed climber. They're like, wow, physically this feels so easy compared to what I've been training for my whole life. And so I can kind of see the adventure pendulum swinging back to some extent as some of these climbers realize that they're so much better than their predecessors that they're like, oh, I can easily scoop up records.
Yeah, I like that. And I could see it too. And, you were talking mostly in terms of speed, but I think it could also go the difficulty route. We just saw Alex Waterhouse and Billy Rideout
Totally.
do the nose, free the nose with very little issue. And they're comp kids, So I think you're right. The kids coming up through the current comp system who've learned climbing as a more athletic thing may very well find this love of the outdoors, and that you might find them out on these remote big walls that haven't been freed but are these known mega projects.
Yeah, part of the reason I think that is just because that was to some extent my own path as a suburban kid that grew up climbing in the gym.
Sure.
And then I started climbing outside and realized that I was just climbing at a slightly higher level than my predecessors. And so the idea of free soloing a 5'11" big wall, you're kind of like, oh, it's 5'11". I've been climbing 5'11" since I was 10 years old. You're kind of like, that seems fine. And it's like now people are going to think the same thing, but at 5'13", 5'14", where they're kind of like, I've literally been climbing that grade since I was 10. It shouldn't be any big deal to free solo it or to speed climb it or do whatever, do all the sort of adventurous things.
Yeah.
I don't know, because I used to sort of explain my own relative success as a climber as like, well, I was just sort of the first generation of gym climbers that came out. It's like I had access to better facilities. I was able to climb a little better. And certainly the next generation is way, way better, way higher standard. Doubt. And so you're kind of like, well, they have a huge opportunity to do things that we could never imagine.
Yeah, that's actually a neat comparison if you think about yours and my generation of climbers followed by whatever the next generations are, because there's a Brooke Rabitou in there who is miles beyond what I will ever climb, and then the next generation below her, there are all these 10-year-olds now climbing mid 514 and upper double digit boulders. So it's not hard to imagine.
We'll be back with more after the break. Dr. Squatch crafts natural, high-performance personal care products with no harmful ingredients. I don't shower often, but when I do, I use Dr. Squatch. I especially like the Wood Barrel Bourbon Bar Soap. From soap to shampoo to conditioner, they help me look, feel, and smell my best for whatever adventure I choose. They're offering new customers 20% off any purchase with the code ClimbingGold. Or you can go to drsquatch.com/climbinggold. The link's in the show notes. Dr. Squatch. Get dirty, stay clean. I first found Coros when I was looking for a GPS watch that could track my biggest outdoor adventures. I needed something with a massive battery life that was also robust enough to handle the climbing. As it turns out, Coros is the only GPS watch brand that has done some serious development for climbers, from multi-pitch GPS tracking to indoor programmed workouts. The watches have a mind-blowing battery life. The Vertex watch series lasts for more than 100 hours in GPS activities, so I only need to charge it once every several weeks. I only need to charge my watch so sporadically that I can never find the charger because I haven't used it in 6 weeks. If you're interested in bringing new technology into your climbing training and tracking, you should consider their new Vertex 2S. Go to Coros.com and use the code ClimbingGold to secure a free watch carabiner with the purchase of your new Vertex 2S. The link's in the show notes.
Kris, you're obviously you're a student of climbing and climbing history. You've got the new podcast out, Written in Stone. And when you look back at the sort of beginning of training, obviously there's John Gill, who comes from the gymnastics world, who's, psyched on rope climbing. And, he brings that sort of early idea of sport to climbing. And then later on, there's the backer ladders, Wolfgang Gulick, what did those people really get right when you look at it now? Because obviously training has advanced a lot. Our knowledge of it has grown quite a bit. But at its core, some of the early practitioners of training and climbing, what did they nail?
Actually, I think the number one thing that they nailed is they were doing training activities that they also enjoyed. They weren't dreading it. It wasn't this job they had to do. So they were doing these things that were fun for them, and I think that's a big number one. Number two, I think, and maybe they took it a little too far if we want to look at the research, but the research doesn't tell the whole story, and I think what they were doing well was they were they were doing things that they knew would translate to climbing. Like Alex talked about before, and like Lisi mentioned, it's hard to get these things to translate to climbing. And the things they were doing had enough of the elements of climbing that they were able to translate them. I don't necessarily think that's the most efficient way to do it.
So you mean like sport specific, like specificity to climbing?
Yeah, they were being pretty sport specific to what they were doing. And maybe it's not the most efficient way to get stronger or more powerful, but it does translate faster to climbing.
Kris, I'm curious, like, you're obviously like kind of early towards the becoming like a professional coach, like inside of our space. And
yeah,
I imagine, have kind of had to be quite creative and invent a lot and do all that. And like, how'd you do it? That's it's progress and it's pushing our sport in its own way. But how did you tackle something like that of like, this is a sport that doesn't really have a lot of structure to it, and I need to figure out how to do this in a way that becomes replicable for people?
Yeah, and you know what, Fitz, it might even be trickier that I'm trying to train adults instead of working within the like comp scene where there is a little more structure, and I hugely admire what those coaches do. But when I first came in, it was definitely, you had to convince people. I had to convince gyms to let us do workshops at their gyms because they didn't think anybody would be interested. To be totally honest, I ended up blowing my shoulder up at work. I was a mural artist at the time, so I'd spent a lot of time with my right arm over my head, and I destroyed my shoulder, and workers' comp was paying me for 6 months to not work. So I had 6 months to figure out how to better deliver training plans to the people I was working with, and it was miserable, just like writing this PDF and getting on the phone with somebody for a couple of hours talking about it, and then I'd never hear from them again. And it was miserable. So I figured out this better way. And at the time, I think there was one other remote coach, a guy in Australia, who was working, through an app with folks. And I just decided I'm going to try to do that. And I just built it up, piece by piece, trying to figure out what it was people wanted, what was effective for people. And I think all the while, I was just driven by the fact that even when I'm not out climbing myself and I'm putting this extra time into coaching when I could be out there climbing, I get to live vicariously through all these people who are sending their projects, and I get to be a part of this story with them. And for me, that just kept me going, and it keeps me going now, trying to keep innovating and keep coming up with ways to help people more effectively.
Yeah, I'm curious, what would you say is Power Company's secret sauce? Like, what's the thing that you guys feel like you do best as climbing trainers?
I think mostly it's we are all climbers, and we love climbing, and we're out there climbing, and it's a debate for us. Do I want to be out there climbing, or do I want to be in here coaching and writing training plans? Frankly, I think that's the thing that does it, because if you're an outdoor rock climber, it's so helpful to have a coach who's been in all those situations and all those scenarios, and understands that the anxiety of now I'm close on my project and I have to really make it happen, that like send anxiety and watching the weather intensely to try to figure out what's the best day to go try, that sort of headspace is so important. And that there are millions of other scenarios like that, but the coaches at Power Company have been there. We've done that, and I think that's a really important thing. I know the folks at Lattice are in a similar situation, and Climb Strong is in a similar situation where they have real dedicated climbers there working, and I think that's what matters.
Well, I guess that's kind of my question is, what differentiates the different companies? Like, presumably everybody, or at some point, climbing coaching will specialize into specifics.
Sure.
Like this company specializes on getting kids into the Olympics or whatever, or like this company helps people send their project outdoors or, I'm sort of curious, like as the sport grows, as the space grows, like as training within climbing blows up so much, like how did all these different training programs start to differentiate themselves?
It's tricky, I think, but I think you're hitting on something we've been talking about a lot, is that we've really solidified that people are willing and accepting of training, and they want to train. And now I think maybe we've like pushed the ball too far in that direction, and we haven't been talking enough about the performance of climbing outside and the mental space, the approach to it, all of those things have to come into it. It's not just the training side. So I think some coaches are going to be very good at training, and maybe, Alex, what needs to happen is there's a separation between trainers and coaches. I see myself much more on the coaching side as opposed to the training side. I understand the training part of it, but it's not what I love. And there are some people who love the training side of it, and I'm glad they do, and I'm glad they keep digging into that stuff. So maybe in the future, that's where it goes. Maybe that's the logical place. Most sports have that. They have trainers, coaches.
Yeah, that's a good distinction, because I feel like in climbing, most climbers still use those terms almost interchangeably. We're like, I'm going to train, or I have a coach, or whatever.
We do, yeah.
But you're right that if you're a professional football player, your coach and your trainer are completely different people that do completely different things, totally different roles.
Totally.
So yeah, maybe you're right that climbing, as it grows up, will start to differentiate between those activities.
Yeah, I hope that's where it goes. And we've been talking a lot about how we've contributed to the problem of making those words interchangeable, and how do we pull ourselves back and start differentiating between those two terms.
Yeah, how do you disentangle those? I know it's interesting because basically any climber that's going to do any kind of workout is like, now I'm going to train.
I'm going to train, yeah.
And I'm always kind of like, I was like, is it training if you're just working out haphazardly from time to time?
Yeah.
I feel like training is just slightly more structured, slightly more long-term. But, any one session is like, I'm going to work out at the gym.
Yep.
Which is still great, but you're just kind of like, is that training? I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah, that's just exercising at that point.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're just working out.
Like, you talk about this sort of idea of coaching, right? And there's obviously ways to get your fingers strong. That's not necessarily going to relate to success. Like, how do you walk people through understanding that there's a difference between results and success? I know that sounds sort of strange, but those are two different things. Like, how do you get people through that?
We fall back on a phrase that we quote all the time. It's from a strength coach named Dan John. He's a throwing coach, like shot putters and discus. And his phrase is, the goal is to keep the goal the goal. And essentially what that means is if you want to become a better climber, we make sure that you're not focused on your hangboard numbers or can you do 159 on a campus board. And we collect a lot of data, strength data, metrics from climbers, but we've tried really hard not to make that the focus, to look at what are your climbing numbers. Did you get out for more pitches? Did you do that 512 faster than you've done other 512s? Doesn't have to be, did you climb a new grade, but is something improving in your actual climbing as opposed to, did your bench press improve, or did your finger strength numbers improve, or whatever? So I think we have to keep the goal and look at the metrics of the actual climbing as opposed to, and I use the word metrics there, even though I don't like it in that term, in that sense. We look at the experience of the climbing as opposed to just the numbers.
That kind of reminds me of a concept that I've borrowed from European climbers, or sort of Spanish climbers, like sensations. Like, oh, my sensations on the route were really good. And I think that all the time, because a lot of the time you can't necessarily quantify progress. Like, you didn't send, you didn't even necessarily do any better, but you felt really good doing it. And I feel like, it's hard to quantify it, but sensations do matter in that context, where you're like, like I was climbing the same as always, but I felt great while I did it.
Exactly.
And there's something to be said for that. Like, if you're having great sensations or having like a good day at the crag, even if you don't send, you're like, that's like, it's working. Like, positive sensations, all good stuff.
Yeah. I mean, improving your climbing might be you were willing to get on your project and it felt okay in front of a crowd of people. that might be a big improvement. Your numbers may not go up for a couple of seasons, but now if you feel more comfortable trying in front of a crowd of people, your numbers are going to go up. No matter how strong your fingers are, that crowd's going to hold you back every single time.
That's an example of coaching versus training.
Yeah,
like if you can help somebody get through the mental hurdles of performing in front of others, I mean, that all seems like coaching. Whereas training is like, can they do a one arm on the first hold of the route? Just to wow the crowd as they pull off the ground. Oh, here we go.
I mean, I want to do a one arm off the first hold of every route, but
I was like getting ready for this interview. I was thinking back to like, especially the period of my life where I really was trying to make progress in climbing, and like thinking about like what got in your way. And then I was like totally laughing because I was like, I just never rested. Like I just never rested.
Real.
Like I remember this, like being at Red Rocks way back in the day and be like, oh, like probably have climbed 7 straight days, just thrashed myself. And my idea of rest day was to like, oh, I'll borrow my friend's mountain bike, ride around the loop, solo dark shadows, and then come back. And that was like my rest day. And that's like what I thought about in my head because I was like, that's that's not pulling hard. That's just doing something else. And
like that does sound like a great rest day.
I know.
Great.
Thanks,
I
Alex.
knew you were going to say that.
I totally validate your approach. I think that's a great rest day.
And I realized that like my actual just for like getting on stone sometimes hampered what I might define as success. And that was a hurdle for me. What are the common ways that you see people that are striving thwart themselves, like, or sort of get in their own way?
Well, I mean, certainly the way you got in your own way back then is still a really common thing. And, to be clear, I don't think it's necessarily bad. Like, I don't think the new climber, the intermediate climber, should be super concerned about that all the time. If you're a weekend warrior and one of the days you're a little tired, that's your day, so what? You need to get out and go climbing. So I don't think that being super concerned about the resting part. We should be resting. I need a lot more rest now than I did 5 years ago. I'm sure, Alex, you're being pushed into middle age. So, you might need some more rest here soon. You might not want to bike to dark shadows. But yeah, I think resting is a big one. I think getting too focused on the grades and the next grade and climbing the hardest things, while it seems like that's leading you upward, it can be really tough to pull out of that when the next grade is unattainable, or you just aren't there yet and it's going to take a long time. Like we mentioned earlier, I think getting caught up in the metrics is really common these days. As we get more metrics, as we get more science, more research coming into climbing, it's very easy to get caught up in those metrics.
Kris, what do you think are the main things that people have gotten wrong?
I don't know that I would say we've gotten anything wrong per se, because I do think...
You're just afraid of calling people out, but let's just hear it. Just start
slandering.
No,
I'm never afraid of calling people out. That's
yeah, that's true, actually.
It's in my DNA to call people out. But I am trying to be more moderate as I get older.
Disappointing for this podcast.
I know. It's sad. It's sad. I'm a grandpa now, Alex.
Yeah, that's true. Got to be nice. No, but surely there's some things you're like, this is just the wrong focus. So one of the things that I think of is that I feel like when you think of Stone Master training, there was a high emphasis on just lots and lots of pull-ups, kind of. And when I was in high school, I was doing 150 pull-ups before bed every night, just on my pull-up in my door frame. Like sets of 30, sets of 35, just like hammering pull-ups. And at the time, I got to the point that I could do one-arm pull-ups, and I was like, cool, I can do pull-ups like a boss. But I was like, I didn't climb any harder. It didn't make me any better as a rock climber. And now as an adult, I'm like, man, if I did that many pull-ups, I would blow up my elbows. Like, I just can't do that many pull-ups anymore. And frankly, there's no point to it. I'm kind of like, I'd rather do 3 one-arms and call it a session rather than do 150 pull-ups. Yeah. Like, to me, that's kind of an example of like old school training getting it wrong to some extent. It's like the heavy volume.
Yeah, I think that's where it's going. I think the volume was the big issue back then. It was always more instead of higher quality or better.
Or higher intensity.
Yeah, and I think we saw that with like, the Ben Moon, Jerry Moffitt era where they were, they were pushing the limits for sure, and they moved climbing into some cool places, but they also destroyed their elbows in the process because they were on their woodies so much and just doing more and continuing to hammer. And I do think we've gotten a lot smarter about let's keep the intensity high, let's keep the quality high, and then we don't need to do nearly as much and we can get the same benefits. I think another thing maybe that people got wrong in the past that we're now getting better is being able to, if you don't have the means to go climbing outside and you're stuck in the gym doesn't have to look exactly like all of the worst crimps outside. I actually really love the direction gyms are going to a degree. I don't love all of it, but I do love that it's friendlier. It's harder to hurt yourself or hurt your fingers anyway in a gym nowadays. I think that's probably a smart thing with the number of climbers, and it maybe combats the problem with the volume a little bit. I'm not going to go too far in saying that it deletes it, but it certainly combats it a little. You can climb more on those big bulby slopers than you can on tiny little crimps without hurting yourself. And I think just more variety is better, and the gyms are much higher variety now than they used to be when it was just all monos and little crimps,
Yeah, I mean, you think the original moonboard set and you're like, God, that's so fierce in a way that is definitely a good training stimulus, but you're kind of like, is that what you want to climb on all the time? It's like a little too aggressive. You're like, geez Louise.
Yeah. You got to be careful with how much of that you're doing. Just, that's really similar to the Jerry and Ben era of grabbing, hard to hold grips and doing hard moves off of them. You got to be careful with how much of that you're doing.
Earlier, I asked you guys whether you thought we're at the sort of limit of human potential when it comes to climbing. With coaching, with training, because I think that's like one of the really key takeaways is that there's a big difference between coaching and training. But just with the science and the sort of broader application of helping build better climbers, how much growth potential still is there in terms of understanding and knowledge and continuing to improve and refine coaching?
Oh, man, massive. I think it's basically the field of human psychology and, behavioral studies when we start thinking about the coaching side of things. And there's so much to learn. And once we start looking at like the emotional component of, getting attached to rock climbs and getting attached to sending and getting attached to trying my hardest or having my time out there or whatever it is, there's just so much more to learn about people and how we process these things and what that means for our athletic performance. It's such an interesting field, Fitz. I'm constantly reading the research, whether it's the training side or the coaching side, and I just keep learning and keep learning. It's endless.
Yeah, so I think it's so cool that the moment your mind goes right away towards the sort of emotional side of it or the sort of like personal side of it. Versus just like, oh yeah, we need a lot more scientific studies on what happens to people's elbows or whatever. It's like you're like, no. It's actually the mental side that continues to sort of be the place where there's a lot of growth.
Well, I think that I've been climbing a long time, as all of you have, and I think we can all agree that it's very rare that you see a rock climber on a climb and they just aren't strong enough. It's more likely that they're missing the effort or there's anxiety holding them back or they're afraid to fall. There are all these little things that go into holding us back from being better climbers. And certainly we want stronger fingers so we can feel like we're more in control when we grab those holds. But I don't think that's the biggest limiter for the vast majority of climbers. That might be limiting the elite, the top level climbers, but it's not limiting most of the 5'11 climbers the way that we're giving it credit for.
Thank you, Kris, for joining us. You can find Kris's new podcast, Written in Stone, wherever you get your podcasts. You can check out Kris's coaching and training endeavors at powercompanyclimbing.com. Climbing Gold is a production of Duct Tape Then Beer. Alex Honnold is our host. Our production and editing team includes the talents of Lauren Delani Miller, Marco Seiler Gonzalez, and Evan Phillips. Skylar Perwins is our YouTube and social media editor. Music today by Brendan O'Connell. Tracks are courtesy of the artist or Track Club. Our creative director is me, Fitz Cahal. Our executive producers are Jonathan Retzik and Ben Endy for RXR Sports, and Lacey Hendricks and Becca Call for Duct Tape Then Beer. Thanks for listening.